Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of today's webinar is exploring peer-on-peer sexual abuse in schools, and we'll be looking at it, of course, from the perspective of the role of us as governors. Just before we start, a few housekeeping points. We've got a very large number of you joining us this morning, which is always nice to see. If you're not familiar with the platform and haven't actually located the go-to toolbar yet, you'll find there's a little orange rectangle with a white arrow in it in the top right-hand portion of your screen. If you click on that, it will open the toolbar or dashboard, whichever you wish to refer to it as, and that will give you access to all of the controls. So that, amongst other things, you can actually download a copy of the slides that we're going to be sharing with you this morning. You will also find the questions block on there, so if you have any questions or comments at any stage, please do click on the question box. It'll open up the panel and it'll come across in front of us, and we'll do our level best to be able to respond to those. Can I also ask you, just by way of a sound test, if you can hear me okay, if you could at this point find the little hand icon on the toolbar. If you can hear me, click on that to raise your hand, and then we'll know we're all set to go. Lovely. Actually, most people raise their hands. No, that's good, so I'll put them down for you. And with no more ado, we'll kick off. So as I say, a very warm welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. Exploring peer-on-peer sexual abuse in schools is the focus of today. Just before we start off, just say we're not deliberately trying to set out to shock anybody or to be in any way sensationalist about this. We're trying to take a balanced view of what clearly has become a very topical issue in our schools at the moment, and it's an aspect of safeguarding that is not going to go away, and therefore, you know, we are going to be sharing some sensitive information with you this morning, and please see it in that context. I'm Steve Barker, and that's me on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn today. Hi there, Linda.
Good morning, everyone.
Lovely, and we're both here on behalf of Better Governor in partnership with Governors for Schools, and Better Governor is an online governance service which we routinely deliver webinars, podcasts and many other aspects purely on governance, and this is an area that obviously is high on the priority list for a lot of governors this morning. If it's new to you, then perhaps we can provoke a little bit of thought, which is actually our intention today by exploring some of the subject matter. But I'm going to hand over to Linda to talk you through the first few slides. So over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Steve. So as Steve said at the top of the session, this is an emotive subject. We'll all be informed by our own feelings and experience. They sit behind the views that we have. It makes it difficult to talk about. If it's difficult for us as adults to talk about, it therefore translates into the difficulty young people have about speaking about this as a subject. But this is our role as governors. We have a strategic role to play here. So it's about what we can do and plan for the future to make it better. And to think around that subject also means about taking into account the research that Ofsted has done. It's a rapid review research. We'll see. We'll talk about how that came to be. For many of us as adults, we will recognise some of these themes from our own experiences, but we're then needing to take into account this review that has been done, the information that has been, the conversation that has been engendered by that, and therefore translate that into their recommended action, what we need to do about it in our individual schools or academies to ensure that as we move forward, we both reduce the stigma, address the issues and help young people to be confident in managing their own lives. So we're going to look at this from that point of view of safeguarding. This is a vital element of keeping children and young people safe, equipping them with the skills at the various ages and stages of their lives to do this effectively, and then we're going to look at what we need to do next, how we can ensure that our school or academy is doing all it can in the context of a much wider issue for our own pupils and students. So let's look at how we entered into this conversation and where the thinking has been shaped. In 2017, the DfE issued specific statutory guidance to schools about how they should approach operationally the management of sexual violence and sexual harassment between children in schools and colleges. So again, recognising that there was an issue, that there needed to be some clear guidance and instruction for how schools should both collect information and manage incidents and create a culture where the likelihood of these things happening and going unreported and unaddressed was reduced. And that sat alongside and within the school's approach to safeguarding, keeping all children safe. And if you were a governor at that time, you may well have been aware of that introduction alongside the update of keeping children safe in education that year. There is already a new version of this document that is ready to go for September 2021, reflecting some of this learning since 2017. And then in response to an individual's experience, the Everyone's Invited website was started in response to the anti-rape movement, and this was not school related initially. It was an opportunity for individuals anonymously to share their experience and highlight the fact that these issues, no matter how unpleasant we find them, were still happening with an alarming frequency. And in the course of that anonymised testimony sharing, it became very apparent that this was an issue in schools. There were some particularly shocking revelations around some universities and indeed some independent schools. However, to believe that this is something that is isolated to a certain section of society or a certain type of institution would be wrong. And this is very much a picture that then has been added to with alarming numbers. And then because of this increasing picture of reporting, it became very necessary for the DfE to commission a review, and Ofsted was commissioned and reported on the 10th of June this year their findings as a result of having been commissioned to do that review. So let's look at what that review, how this came into being. Go back to the Everyone's Invited website, which is now and continues to be a platform for new testimony. Every day there is some new content there. This is, again, it is not all about schools. It is a much wider community platform, but there are a lot of incidents and quite alarming and distressing testimonies of individuals that do relate to schools. And as a consequence of that, that journey on the Everyone's Invited website, what they did was to create a separate list hosted on the website of the names of the schools that had been divulged in the testimonies of these thousands of individuals who had put their testimonies there. And this showed, and Soma Sara is the founder of initially an Instagram page, and then which continues, and then the website. So there is a little pledge at the beginning of the website before you can look at the schools list, but it reinforces the idea that this is about change and about recognising that we all have a responsibility to make changes that will give young people in the future a better opportunity to address and reduce these incidents. So there is a list of schools on the website. If your school isn't on that list, then it isn't a cause for celebration, because as the review finds, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, It doesn't necessarily mean that this isn't what is happening, but just that it hasn't been reported at this stage. And if you are on the website, and I think it is important to have a look and see if your school is named there. If, as we provide later on in the session, the recommendations of where we might go in terms of our governance role with this, then the question is, do we need to do more than that, or is that sufficient to address the fact that our name is one of those that has been included?
I think it's fair to say, Linda, isn't it, at this stage, that this is still in its infancy, this campaign. Everyone's Invited was only created 12 months or just 11 months ago, very nearly now. The catalyst for it becoming very much more broadly known is actually unfortunately the murder of Sarah Everard this year, the young lady who was murdered by the policeman very near Clapham in South London. That led to this particular website going viral because so many people were just saying, and again brings us back to the roots of this. This is actually about hopefully the ambition to create an anti-rape culture. Obviously, what that's led is it's actually gone far deeper and far wider than that in terms of what's happening in schools, and it's become far more focused. And Ofsted were commissioned by the DfE to look not at a rape culture in school, but actually at a culture that possibly culminated in rape, but actually something that was maybe festering in our society. That means that peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence isn't being tackled to the way it should be, which means that the rape culture that some people are saying it does exist in our country is actually being perpetuated, and that's what this is really all about.
And I think for me, and of course we've got the perspective here of our own views and our own experiences forming here, but if we realise, as the review does explain, that young people feel that their voices have not been heard, if you then are still a young person or have become an adult where you have had an experience that fits this picture, then this may be the only opportunity you've had to have your voice heard, and by having that testimony up, it may become you you have been
I think we've lost Linda's sound for a minute there, folks. So let's
heard. So
are you back with us, Linda?
Views. You can see why this would fill up with people, because it's
Yeah, I'm sorry, folks. I think we seem to have lost Linda's sound there. So I hope you can hear me. I'll pick up, and Linda can rejoin us when her sound actually comes back. Basically, what we're still focusing on here is, in many ways, really those triggers that actually led to the commissioning of the Ofsted rapid review, as it's been called. As we said, it started off on Instagram, then went onto a mainstream website, went viral as a consequence of the Clapham / South Circular murder earlier this year, and then it was picked up by mainstream media. And this slide is really just a page marker for that. ITV or the ITV News, I should say, on their website on the 9th of June, as you can see here, running a story basically about this idea that almost 3,000 schools had actually been named following claims of sexual assault, rape and harassment, as they've described it. So very much playing into this idea that this has now gone beyond rape. This is coming into this arena, which is going back to the slide that we started at with the timeline on. This is actually about the culture and the way in which schools are supporting a movement to stop peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence. So really, this is just to say it has become mainstream. There is absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. And what this led to was obviously Ofsted being commissioned by the DfE, and we're going to come back to that. But we thought at this stage what we'd do is actually just launch our poll for this morning, just to get a feel from you about where this is on your radar in your governing board or governing body at this point in time. So I'm going to launch the poll now, and hopefully that should be on your screen any moment now. There you go, it's up now. If you're not familiar with this platform, if you can't for any reason vote, just try minimizing your screen, assuming that everyone's in full screen mode. That very often does free up the voting panel. But question you can see in front of you there: has your board discussed the growing concerns around sexual violence amongst children and young people? And please cast your votes now. I can see 60% of you have got no problem at all because you're actually already voted, which is great. So we'll leave the poll open for a few moments there. And just whilst we're doing that, I've got a couple of comments on the question box. Joan is asking, I thought the site had removed the list of schools. No, it certainly hasn't. And sorry, I can see Belinda's just answering that for you, Joan, as well. But the list of schools is still up and running, and the number of testimonies is actually recorded on a live update feed on their website on a daily basis. Okay, we've got just over 85% of you voted now, so a couple more moments then, and then I'm going to close that poll down, folks. So if you'd like to vote, now is your last opportunity to do so, if you don't mind. Okay, that's great. I think the last couple of people have voted now, so I'm going to close that poll down and share those outcomes with you. And they should be on your screen now. Okay, so no real surprises here, because again, this is fairly recently come to sort of mainstream media attention, shall we say, which has probably raised its profile for us as governors. But very nearly 40% of you are saying that yes, this has actually already been discussed at board level. That's great. I don't think this is a tick box exercise. That's not the reason for doing this poll at all this morning. That's a good start, I would suggest. But I think as governors, what we need to do now is go back to our schools and say, well, okay, we have discussed it. Are we aware not just of what Ofsted have said in their review, but also the government's response, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of some of the recommendations that Ofsted have made, but also how things like the new publication of Keeping Children Safe in Education, which came out the day before yesterday, but also the amendments to the Ofsted Inspection Handbook have also reflected this research project. So this is the beginning of a dialogue. It's not a one-off event, I would suggest. Similar number of you have actually said no, which is understandable, and there's no implied criticism here at all. Hopefully more of a call to action from our perspective. 13% of you have actually said no, you haven't yet, but it is an agenda item for this term. And I have to say, this is my poll because that's the one I would tick here. So I wrote it particularly. I have a governing body meeting coming up next Friday morning at one of the schools where I'm chair, and it absolutely is on our agenda. And then 11% of you have said that you don't know. Variety of reasons why you may not know. If you're a new governor, worth checking, asking your clerk. If it may have been discussed in a committee, for example, if you've got committee structure in your organisation, then just ask about it. I mean, this I think is sufficiently important now that all governors ought to know about it. So even if it has been discussed at committee level, it's worth referencing within a whole governing body setting, I would suggest as well.
Steve,
okay.
Anne's just asked a question about, does this apply in primary schools as well? And absolutely yes. The review found that there were incidents in primary schools, so we should all be talking about it, because of course the journey of learning about how to manage our behaviour and our feelings and our responses is all part of that. We'll say more about that later. And also I think we need to be aware here that this website is just a platform for anyone to share their experience. So it's not just about schools, it's not just about girls, it's not filtered, because that's the whole process. It's not owned or connected to education or the DfE in any way. This is just about the way that we then as governors use the official guidance that supports the work we do in our role to then focus on what needs to happen in our school to understand this issue and to respond appropriately.
Indeed. Okay, well, thanks for that. And I'm going to hide those results now, and we will move on. Okay, so what we want to do in this next section is actually just look at a sort of top line view of what Ofsted have actually said in their review. And I think it has to be acknowledged first and foremost, nobody is saying this is a piece of definitive research that tells us everything that we need to know about this subject matter. It's called a rapid review as opposed to a research project for a very good reason. Rapid because it was done in a very short period of time, and it is a short-term review. Not a huge number of schools were actually included in this particular piece of research that Ofsted have done, but even though it's only 32 schools and even though it's only 900 pupils, there are some strong messages from Ofsted coming out here, and hopefully they can resonate with all of us. And I think the key issue for me here, and Linda mentioned this earlier, is a recognition that it can happen here. Just because your school's not mentioned doesn't mean to say it doesn't apply to your school. These are accounts that children and young people, and sometimes adults who are going back a while from when they were at school or university, etc., have put on there. These are their perceptions. This is their reality. Therefore, I think as governors, the overriding responsibility that we have is a moral one to say that we need to take this seriously. And that's the general stance that Ofsted have actually taken here. So what the DfE asked Ofsted to do was to explore safeguarding and the place that it had in the curriculum. And obviously the relevance of its place in the curriculum is how are we teaching, how are we sharing those key messages with children and young people to instill in them the idea that this anti-rape culture is really important and that peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence has no place in our society. Ofsted also were looking at the government's request at multi-agency arrangements. So in other words, through your local safeguarding arrangements in whichever local authority or borough you're in, how does that tie into the work of schools? What engagement do they have? And also, most importantly, again, coming back to the comment that Linda made earlier, but also the point I just reiterated then, actually taking this seriously. How do we look at, and again, the term victim here, Ofsted make the point very well in that we shouldn't get too hung up about the terminology. Victim and perpetrator is quite accusational language. Language is everything, of course, but victim is actually what's used on the everyone's invited site. Therefore, Ofsted have used that language because it's also the sort of language that the DfE use, but recognizing that that in itself is quite loaded. But this third bullet point is about how do schools ensure that they are listening to what their pupils are telling them, and then how do we ensure that there is that culture where any concerns, any events, etc., do get reported? Because one of the biggest conclusions at the moment, there's an awful lot of non-reporting actually taking place, and I think the lady who started this campaign talks about the tip of the iceberg, and I think that very much is the feeling that a lot of people in government and certainly in Ofsted have got at the moment, that there's a lot of non-reporting out there as well. And Ofsted then actually looks at a number of other factors as well, which they've included in their report. And I can see there is a question on the panel, what do we mean victim's voice? That, as I say, that's purely and simply the idea that we are encouraging children, young people in our schools to come forward if they're concerned, if they think something has happened to them.
And I think that we have to be aware here that there is a multiple victim issue here, that some children who are also, if we use the language used here, perpetrators, are themselves victims elsewhere. So it's not ever a simple solution that's a one-size-fits-all. There is layers to this which all fall under that safeguarding aspect.
Indeed. Okay, well, these are just some of the quotes and from the key findings in the report. This is, I have to say, I put this PowerPoint together, so these are my views on what I believe the key messages are coming out of what Ofsted have said in their review. And the first one you see there, top left, rapid thematic review. So again, that's just making that point that we said earlier about how it was commissioned and how it was conducted. But key message here, has revealed how prevalent sexual harassment and online sexual abuse are for children and young people. The reason I think that one's important is because certainly from a police perspective, and the police have been heavily involved in this campaign as well, of course, not least of all because of the murder of that young lady in Clapham that we referred to earlier. But the police have said that this isn't necessarily just focused on schools. This is a much wider remit, and that wider remit is absolutely about social media and the way in which the whole online experience that children and young people have now has actually allowed this to mushroom in quite the way that it appears it has. Then if we move across to top right, for some children, incidents are so commonplace that they see no point in reporting them. And again, that's probably the most damning thing from our perspective as governors, because no matter what we might say and do, what policies we have in place, what procedures there are for hopefully facilitating young people and children to actually come forward, they don't see any point in doing it because this is actually what they perceive as part of life at the moment. So there's a real call to action for me here, I think, as a governor, and that's how in the schools where I'm a governor, how can all of us on this call today get to a situation where actually it might be commonplace, but there actually is a point in reporting, and that's what we need to get out of this, I would suggest. But sexual harassment and online sexual abuse, such as being sent unsolicited explicit sexual material and being pressured to send nude pictures, are much more prevalent than adults realise. Well, that comes back to Linda's point, and there's a lot of things going on that, some might be uncomfortable, some might be taboo for us to actually think about and talk about, but actually this is part of the real life experience for an awful lot of children and young people in our society at the moment, and that's why as governors we need to be part of the movement to hopefully change the culture that appears to be in existence in our schools at the moment. And then the comment at the bottom of the slide there recommends that schools act as though sexual harassment and online sexual abuse are happening even where there are no specific reports. So again, coming back to Linda's comment earlier, even if your school is not named, that does not mean that there are no issues in your school. And I think this is probably the, one of the strongest recommendations I've seen in a research report for a long time. But everybody in school needs to believe this is happening, and therefore what should we do about it? Not what should we consider doing because it might be, but actually taking that very positive, definitive standpoint that says, no, it's happening here, but actually maybe we've got a situation where our children, our young people, either are frightened to report or don't see any point in reporting, etc. We've got to do something about it. I can see there's an awful lot of questions coming up on the question panel at the moment about some of the technical aspects of the research, the methodology, etc. I don't really want to go into those today. As I say, nobody is presenting this as a piece of empirical research. Ofsted, most of all, are very emphatic about that. If you want to read about the methodology, we've given you the link for the report itself at the end. Could I respectfully suggest that you have a look at it there? But this is really just a snapshot, which is what Ofsted were asked to do by the government, about where this situation is right now in our schools. And I think I would encourage everybody to perhaps look at it in that way. Okay, so just a little word here about some of the data that Ofsted have produced. And again, bearing in mind the comment I've just made, this has to be seen in context of the number of schools involved and the number of pupils, etc. But 1,000 is not, it was 900 pupils, nearly 1,000. 1,000 is not an unrealistic base for research. So I think there are some serious messages for us here. So First piece of data that we've got here, 90% of girls and almost 50% of boys have said that they have at some stage been sent explicit pictures or videos of things they didn't want to see. So this is, again, something that, you know, we may not say, well, that can't possibly happen in my school. Actually, we need to believe that it could happen in our schools, and therefore it's something that perhaps we need to be asking questions about as governors as to how we can actually stem this tide. Similarly, 92% of girls and 74% of boys said that sexist name calling happens a lot or sometimes to them or their peers. And again, yeah, sexual abuse and violence, there is a continuum here, but actually if things like name calling and that very sexist element of that goes unchecked, goes unnoted, unreported in schools, then that can lead obviously to more serious incidents along that continuum that we're talking about here. Ofsted quote in their document the fact that since 2013, when records first started being collected on this, specifically about school children, there's been a 267% increase in reported child sexual abuse offences. So again, that's just a little bit of context. Ofsted have quoted that in the review. That's not their research, that's independent research. But again, you can find the links for that in the document. And then again, something else that Ofsted have actually quoted in their document, and this is data that was produced in 2018-19, but was an analysis of permanent exclusions from schools in the 5 preceding years. And what we saw there is that there was an increase, and the analysis showed that over that 5-year period, every year, the average number of pupils excluded for what was noted on the exclusion documentation as sexual misconduct was 91 per year, and actually accounted for 1.3% of all permanent exclusions. Now, okay, 1.3% may be a small number, it's still too many. And I think that those are the messages that I would want people to take away from this particular set of data that we're looking at. So in terms of talking about what we should take away from this, and I think for me at this point is just worth pausing and saying, well, okay, there's a lot of operational information here, and again, Linda and I are not advocating that this becomes an operational crusade for us as governors. However, there is a role for governance here. And I think the role for governance, first and foremost, is to actually take on that understanding and that acceptance that peer-on-peer sexual abuse is absolutely a fundamental aspect of safeguarding. We want our children, young people in our schools to be safe, including safe from sexual abuse from their peers, from their fellow pupils. That's something that hasn't had perhaps the same degree of importance put on it historically, because when most of us think about sexual abuse from a safeguarding perspective, forgive the gender stereotyping here, but we tend to think of dirty old men abusing children. An awful lot of sexual abuse of children and young people in our society is actually committed by their peers, by fellow children, by fellow young people in schools. And it's absolutely vital that we actually take that on board. What we should be saying as governors, of course, in our governing bodies, in our boards, is that schools actually do regard that peer-on-peer sexual abuse as every bit of much of a threat as radicalisation, county lines, and some of those other prevalent threats at the moment to child safety and well-being in our schools. I think there was a big movement back in 2015 when the prevent duty first came on board, that people were seeing this somehow as a little bit disconnected from safeguarding. Hopefully that's no longer the case. We treat children who are vulnerable to radicalisation in exactly the same way as we treat children and young people who are vulnerable to any other form of abuse or neglect. And the same should be true of peer-on-peer sexual abuse. So there are some questions that come out of that, of course, from a governance perspective, and we'll come to that a little bit later. But also, I think our feeling is that governing boards should also be seeking that assurance from their schools that they are adopting that mentality that it can happen here, perhaps it is happening here. And it's only by adopting that mindset or that mentality that as governors, we can have that assurance, we can be assured that this is something that's being tackled, so that we do move to a situation where our children and young people do feel that they are empowered to say something, to act about it. Quick question, sorry, Shamini. Shamini's asking, does county lines mean gang violence? It's linked to that. County lines is the idea that children, sometimes very young children, are being used to transport either the proceeds of crime or drugs, weapons, etc., across county boundaries or borough boundaries, etc. It's been a theme that's used and a title that's used to describe that activity for a couple of years now. Okay, so let's move on at that stage. So recommendations as far as Ofsted's report is actually concerned, specifically at schools. So obviously this is not an exhaustive list of Ofsted's recommendations. I don't want to pretend that that's the case at all, but what I would like everybody to actually think about is that these are the things that actually as governors we can be asking questions about, and we can then hopefully ensure that something is done, so that this is you know, raising up the list of priorities within our schools and trusts. First recommendation from Ofsted is that schools should all assume that sexual harassment and online sexual abuse are happening. So again, very much reiterating that theme that, yeah, it could happen here. Ofsted are, of course, very focused on curriculum in schools at the moment. There's no doubt about that. That's not going to go away. But of course, the curriculum is absolutely central to this. This is about how are we preparing our children for later life, and for a later life that's safe, secure, and protects their well-being. So it's absolutely fundamental here. And what Ofsted is saying is that there needs to be a curriculum for relationship, sex, and health education, and those have been very topical discussions in a lot of our webinars on Better Governor for a long period of time now. New statutory curriculum is actually in place, but what Ofsted is saying is that that statutory curriculum, which all schools should be teaching from the beginning of this summer term, the deadline was put back a little bit, but all schools should be following that new curriculum now. But Ofsted want to see that carefully sequenced, and what carefully sequenced means, of course, is that we are building children's and young people's knowledge as they progress through the age ranges, etc. And we are tackling some of those issues, and we'll come back to this in a little more detail in a couple of slides' time. We're tackling those issues at an age appropriate and a developmental stage appropriate way with children and young people in our schools. And they're also saying that that curriculum needs, as part of that sequencing, to build in time where children and young people can actually have opportunities to talk about some of the things that they find difficult to report, some of the things that they find difficult to discuss. And of course, we are talking about societal change here. Some parents don't find it difficult, find it uncomfortable. It doesn't matter the language that we use, but don't talk to children about some of the things that they need to do to be more resilient, to actually protect themselves, etc. And very often we make a taboo of a lot of these issues around sex and relationships, so that it becomes secretive. And of course, that whole idea of any kind of secretiveness around this does nothing to actually help the cause here of reducing the incidence of these particular events.
I just want to say here, Steve, that we're not emphasising that this is a governor role. This is about us seeking assurance that the school is doing this. This is their operational delivery, but it is important to understand it's happening.
Absolutely. And I think the last one here is very much, sorry, the third one here rather is very much a good example of that. We want assurance, of course. This is about schools, but we as governors want assurance that our schools are thinking about how they approach this from a behavioural perspective, including the sort of sanctions. And again, we're talking about appropriate sanctions. We're not talking about punishment here. We're talking about appropriate sanctions, which reinforce this idea that sexual harassment and including the online aspects of abuse here are not tolerated in our school, are not tolerated in our society. That's what this is about. This is about taking a positive, proactive approach to this. And I think we've got to, as governors, ensure that we perhaps are asking those questions that ultimately lead to this becoming the reality. And part and parcel of that, of course, in terms of it becoming a reality, is that we need to ensure that there is training not just for staff, but also for ourselves as governors as well. And Ofsted have actually gone to the length here of saying then that training should be specifically focused on understanding the definitions, and that's about recognising some of the terminology that's used, etc. as well. For school staff specifically, identifying those signs, and then also about how schools are expected to actually respond to incidents, reporting, etc., as and when they arise. Sorry, I do apologise. Okay, so the next slide really is starting to, perhaps unpick that a little bit. So, the last one there also talked about the need for definitions to be clearly understood. And so what we've done here is actually used the list of definitions that Ofsted have actually reiterated in their report. And these are the definitions that come out of the Department for Education and focus on what they are using as working definitions for these various terms. Sexual violence. Sexual violence, of course, includes issues such as rape. It's also assault by penetration and other forms of sexual assault. In other words, sexual violence is physically forcing, one person physically forcing themselves on another. And again, big temptation here, but do not be tempted to think that this is just male on female. It really isn't. The vast majority of it might be, but it really isn't. And we need to think about protecting all children, all young people from all forms of sexual violence. Sexual harassment, of course, starts with those unwanted comments, but more sexualized comments are very much part of the continuum here, including casual remarks, jokes, online sexual harassment. And again, I think we can't underestimate the amount of clandestine, secret activity going on social media groups. WhatsApp and Instagram are particularly named as being two of the most prominent, but that changes all of the time in terms of what comes in and out of favour with children and young people, of course. But the threat that online activity, or the level of threat that online activity actually constitutes as part of sexual harassment, is something that we have to take very seriously. So going back to the idea of the curriculum, that carefully sequenced curriculum ought to include: when do we start talking about safe online interaction? When do we start talking about not just the positives, but actually some of those negative aspects, some of the risks associated with social networking, etc.? And of course, the thing to say here, as with any kind of bullying or harassment, it can just be a one-off incident, or it can be part of a more concerted campaign, which Ofsted are describing here as a broader pattern of abuse. So sexual harassment can be a one-off event. We should not lose sight of that, and that should be treated every bit as seriously. But those more sustained periods of longer-term bullying, of course, are something that schools most definitely should be looking to tackle. Upskirting is a term that came into parlance a few years back now. Certainly it's been used in keeping children safe in education, which of course is the statutory guidance on safeguarding in all educational establishments. And the upskirting is this idea of taking photographs. It's not just children, anybody can do this, typically involving taking pictures under a person's clothing. So of course it's a graphic term. I mean, it actually says what it's doing. But of course the key bit here is it's done without the knowledge of the person who's having the photograph taken. And again, we can't lose sight of the fact that the vast majority of people doing this are doing it for reasons of sexual gratification or to cause humiliation, distress, or alarm. they may not realize that. And again, this comes back to Linda's point earlier that, you know, we said that, you know, the victim perpetrator labels are not perhaps terribly helpful, but very often the people who are taking these photographs, and again, they are focusing on, you know, the other person's genitals, you know, rear end, etc. They are taking this because something in their lives has made them believe this is actually an acceptable thing to do. And again, we've had this happen in primary schools. You might just think that this is confined to secondary. It most certainly is not. But again, completely unacceptable. But this is, again, something where children and young people believe, well, it's just one of those things that happen. It's not, because it is humiliating and upsetting for, you know, the vast majority of people it happens to, and it should be taken seriously. And then the last one is sexting. And again, sexting is a word that came into the lexicon a few years back now. The police refer to it as youth-produced sexual imagery. And this is the practice of children, young people, sometimes adults, of course, as well, forcing children, there's a big crossover here into child sexual exploitation, of course, forcing children, underage young people, to take sexually explicit naked photographs of themselves and to share them with others via either social networking or the internet. Now, a lot of young people, in some research that was done 3-4 years ago, didn't see this as a problem. The problem there, of course, is that it's a very focused view. If you think you're in a relationship and you're the person you're in that relationship with asks you to do something, do you take that as quite a serious threat, as you should do? If that relationship ends a few months later, suddenly an image of you that has been created by you and shared can be shared whenever. You have absolutely no control over it, and that image exists forever. And this is part of the learning that we need our children and our young people in schools to really take seriously. Is something you put on the internet today or onto social media today stays with you for the rest of your life potentially. It never goes away. And that's why sexting is so dangerous, because many people get involved in sexting when they're in happy, healthy relationships. Those relationships don't always stay that way, and very often ends up with people being exploited, sometimes you know, coerced, sometimes actually being forced to hand over money in order to supposedly protect their anonymity, etc.
The other thing I would add there, Steve, is that this, in the review, they found that very high numbers of boys and girls were encouraged to share pictures, nudes, as we've talked about already. And this, again, falls into that, because it's usually Snapchat or WhatsApp is the most preferred method here. And these are what these are also classed as youth-produced sexual imagery. So it may be, as you suggest, within a relationship, but there is an awful lot of pressurized expectation. Well, everybody else in the class has shared theirs, so it's, you know, if you don't, you know, then there's a little bit of bullying that may go on. So these are all things that have become so endemic that young people think that even if they say something, because everybody seems to be taking no notice of it, it is almost normalized, when of course it absolutely shouldn't be and isn't correct. But this is, the imagery is one of the biggest things that has been fueled by the use of handheld technology and the opportunities that affords, and the boundaries that we support our young people to find in managing their way through these kind of pressures.
Absolutely. And then if we go on to harmful sexual behaviour, which is the second element of this in terms of definitions that Ofsted have actually highlighted. And again, this definition that we've got on the page in front of you now is the definition that Ofsted use, because it's based on the Department for Education definition. And it's, you can see here on the screen, sexual behaviours expressed by children and young people under the age of 18 that are developmentally inappropriate. So the key phrase there, developmentally inappropriate. They may also, of course, be harmful towards the individual themselves or to others, or abusive to other children or young people, or indeed sometimes adults. So That's the broad definition. That's what schools have to perhaps confront, and as governors we have to ensure that schools are confronting. Do we actually understand what's meant by this term harmful sexual behaviour? Because it does happen in schools, and of course one of the things that Ofsted have said in this is that any child or young person that does exhibit harmful sexual behaviour may need a safeguarding response themselves. It's not just about victims here, but we should always be asking, well, if it's again, if it's age inappropriate or developmentally inappropriate, how is the school actually tackling that? How are we ensuring that as governors that the questions are being asked? And again, we're not getting involved ourselves at an operational level here, but we want assurance that the questions being asked, how does that person know that? If it's developmentally or age inappropriate, how does that child or that young person know that? What's happened in their life that's meant that this is perhaps in a risk or a danger of actually being normalized behavior? So that's a key element of that, without any doubt whatsoever. What I've done on this next slide, and again, I'm sorry, I know one or two people put some comments when they looked at the handout. This was quite difficult to read, so I do apologise. When you download the handout, you are able to use the Zoom feature, obviously, when looking at the PDF going forward. But this was just a way of hopefully giving you a little bit of an insight into the kind of things that we're talking about. Linda mentioned earlier.
It is a page in the review, isn't it, Steve? So if you're looking at the review, you'll find this particular definition as part of that document without the overlay that Steve is using here.
Exactly. So I think if you want to see the text behind it, that is in the review, as Linda said. The green circles on here are mine. I've actually overlaid these because I think the key element for us as governors is to ensure that A, we have a level of understanding, but more importantly, or equally as importantly, I would suggest that we want assurance that staff in our schools understand what we actually mean by this. Harmful sexual behaviour is used as a term to describe a variety of behaviours, shall we say, in schools. You can see the source of this. It comes from 2010, and it's a paper called Children, Young People and Sexual Violence, written by S. Hackett. And this is something that the DfE are very keen that we approach, that we use rather, as a graduated approach. So we've got a starting point here of normal, going through inappropriate, problematic, abusive and violent behaviours. So in other words, harmful sexual behaviour, we have to recognise there is a start point, and obviously there's a very serious, the highest level of concern here. So all I've done with these green circles, because some of the language that is used here, aren't necessarily easily understandable by everybody. So just to try and make it perhaps a little more real, because this is a real threat, and that's the whole point of this session today. Normal, developmentally expected, etc. One child, very young child in perhaps a primary school, an infant school, etc., even in an early years setting, stroking another child's hair. That's the kind of thing experimentally children do. It's just about normal content. There's nothing inappropriate about that at all. That's perfectly normal behaviour. If we then cross the bridge, if you like, from what would be acceptable, what is normal, what is appropriate, into what's not, at the first level that we get to is that level that's labelled as inappropriate. And there an example would be, in an early years setting, one child kissing another. Now, kissing is part of life. It's something that most children will see adults in their families, etc., and others doing on a fairly regular basis. It is not something that we would say is appropriate. I can personally remember being in a school a few years ago when this the DfE guidance first came out, and a member of staff actually relayed a story to me where they'd seen one child in early years going up and kissing another child on the lips, and all the staff said, "Oh, isn't that sweet?" Well, no, it's not anymore, because actually if that goes unchecked, if that child does, or if both children involved do not understand that that is not socially acceptable, it's not actually acceptable from a respecting everybody's private space, etc., what does that unchecked behaviour then develop onto? And of course, one of the aspects of developing into perhaps more serious concerns here is the next stage, which is when it becomes slightly problematic. And if it's problematic, what we're probably talking about there is behaviours which, again, if they go unchecked, get more serious. There may not be any real harm here, there may not be any real abuse here, but my example is a Key Stage 2 child claiming that X is their girlfriend or their boyfriend or whatever. That may be it could be unrequited, of course. It may actually be something the other doesn't actually know about, but those kind of things happen in our schools. And again, it's not the kind of thing that we should all be standing back and saying, oh, it's quite cute, isn't it? It's not cute. It is potentially harmful. And again, I'm using choose my language very carefully. It's potentially harmful. So we need to make sure that there are appropriate responses to all of these being given in our school. Those aren't the kind of things that we would expect from 8 and 9-year-olds. They're really not. And again, the stepping stone for me, or the link between each of these, is that if it goes unchecked at that age, so if in Key Stage 2 those kind of things go unchecked and it's perfectly acceptable, there's an aspect of kind of domination here which could potentially lead on to abuse. And again, an example here of an abusive harmful sexual behaviour is a secondary example in Year 8, if you have a pupil sending uninvited naked selfies to other people. Now that happens in our schools, and that is abusive behaviour. Nobody's actually asked for that to happen. It's a criminal offence apart from anything else anyway, but this is part of the problem. This is a very common occurrence, happening under the radar, very often going unreported. And then, of course, ultimately, again, if that goes unchecked, if that goes unchallenged, or the message is that that's entirely inappropriate, as well as being illegal, you then potentially risk getting into what would become the most serious form of harmful sexual behaviour when it turns violent. And any kind of behaviour that includes physical forcing one child or young person to do something else, or to have something else done to them, falls into that category. So the example I've given here is a Year 10 pupil pinning another pupil against a wall and forcing a kiss, or worse. And hopefully you can see from this that we are talking about a gradation of seriousness here, but actually each one of these could be nipped in the bud by taking action at the earliest stage. So thinking about what are those behaviours at very youngest children that actually are normal, but some will then fall into the inappropriate stage. And it is that, and I hope you can see my cursor at the moment, it's the bridge between the normal and the inappropriate, which is where schools can make most difference in my view. Clearly there is an absolute imperative to tackle each of the others, there's no doubt about that whatsoever, but as governors, our challenge is to ensure that staff in schools understand what we mean by these definitions of harmful sexual behaviour and know how to intervene and to actually do something about them. So, effective governance of school provision, what we're talking about, of course, is ensuring that our schools do something here. And the reason I've put this ensure by seeking assurance in that box at the top, that's what governance is all about. And those of you who've been to some of these webinars that Linda and I have led for Governors for Schools in the past on behalf of Better Governor will know that we often use this phrase, ensure by seeking assurance, because that's the heart, that's the crux of what governance is all about. So we ensure by seeking assurance in relation to peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence. We ensure by seeking assurance that first and foremost we've got a safeguarding policy. We've got a safeguarding policy that references and includes how we challenge, respond, how we deal with peer-on-peer sexual abuse. We know that our school has got appropriate procedures in place, including sanctions and including being able to respond to occurrences. We also ensure that staff do have access to appropriate training on this subject, and that's absolutely vital here. We ensure that data is collected. Sorry,
there's
Linda.
a question on that, Steve, in terms of of good quality staff training, and I know it's something you and I touched on when we talked before this session, your DSLs in your schools or academies, designated safeguarding leads, are often part of a wider network of schools or of DSLs. Local authorities and academy chains often have this training offers put in place, but it is about asking those questions. Where are we going to get that training from? Because I think it is vital. And how has the school or academy tested the quality of that in the light of these changes? So increasing pupil voice, listening to children, using the right language, spotting and identifying. So it's a really important question. There's not a one answer, but it starts with the DSL for your school or academy, doing that research, finding out what is available in your area, and then testing the quality of it, whether it's right for the context of your school.
Absolutely. Again, data collected, in other words, is this being reported to governors? Do we know what the extent of the problem is in our schools? And again, coming back to that idea of recognising it could happen here, fundamental to that. We haven't said much about external agencies. Ofsted did mention it, of course, in their review, but from a governor's perspective, at what stage do we get external agencies? And external agencies, of course, can also include the police, children's services, social care, whatever they're called in your authority. But are they being engaged with in an appropriate way by our school? Curriculum we've talked about, of course, already. And ultimately, the challenge for all of us, of course, is about how do we empower and encourage our children and young people to say something if they're concerned, if they are in fact already victims of abuse. And that's obviously a real challenge for all of us. And ultimately, that means, of course, that effective governance oversight is actually characterised by these factors that I'm actually talking about on this slide here, that you have got a safeguarding governor in place, or that could be a committee, it could be a small group of governors that have this remit. But again, the challenge here, some people said we should have a governor with a specific responsibility for peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence. No, we shouldn't. This is part of safeguarding. This should be part of their role. It should be part of their remit. There should, as part of our response to this, of course, be regular reporting from the designated safeguarding lead to the full governing body. It's fine to go through a committee as well, but this is a governance responsibility. All governing bodies need to actually have an understanding of what's happening here. I mentioned earlier that there's a new edition of Keeping Children Safe in Education. It was published on Monday this week. And we've also got a new, not a new Ofsted framework, we've got update to the handbook supporting the Ofsted framework, as well as updated DfE guidance, all of which now refer to this Ofsted report and hint at what the expectations on schools are. So again, making sure that those key documents are used not just to inform our knowledge as governors, but actually to have an impact on practice in our schools. And of course, ultimately, what we are aiming to do as governors, as part of our strategic oversight, is seek assurance. So we ensure by seeking assurance, we're seeking assurance that all children and young people in our schools are safe from peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence. Now that brings us to the end of what we want to say. I'm sorry, we have run a couple of moments over, so I do apologise. I know we've had a lot of questions already, but if there are any final questions, or if Linda, if you're aware there are any on the panel that we could respond to now.
Lorraine's made a question around the role of that safeguarding overview and what to monitor. And we've always said when we've done other sessions relating to safeguarding, it is the first step for you as a governing body is to understand the safeguarding context at your school and the risks that your young people face. We've focused on one particular risk today. So dependent on your context, if you have a number of safeguarding issues or risks that you are managing, you may have a sharper focus on safeguarding as a result. So I don't think there's a one answer to how you do it, but it is about making sure that you cover all of those main risks and that you have enough assurance information provided to you by the school and any external DSL or other, and sometimes you have a local authority or a school improvement visit that gives you external feedback. So it's about using all the evidence and being really aware of your context. Add more where you need to. If you don't need to, then, you know, focus on those really important things in the right way, but understand your context.
Yeah, and that key issue, of course, about context, Ofsted is saying, even if you don't think it is, you should make this part of your context. Question here from John. We'll make this the last one, folks, just in view of the time, if we may. So if there are any other questions that we haven't answered, as ever, I will go back through the report afterwards and get back to you individually. But John has asked a question: how should schools deal with very slow responses from external agencies to referrals? That's always a problem, John. You're absolutely right. And I think this may sound glib, and please forgive me, I don't intend it to, but escalate it is the only way to do that. I think the very fact that you know, we're being told that maybe this doesn't meet threshold, something like this absolutely should. And if you have any concerns, if schools have concerns, then we should be encouraging our schools to contact the police if it's a very serious issue here. But social care should be involved. If we don't think we're getting the response, we raise it again, or we ensure the school's raising it again, I should say, and ultimately it may be that the safeguarding governor or the chair of governors has to escalate it to the head of children's services, because actually there is a statutory responsibility on the local authority. Again, there's a balancing act here because there will be thresholds of intervention. So of course, sometimes that will happen, but there are things that schools can do. And I think Ofsted are not saying that, you know, schools are in a position to change the world in its entirety, but what Ofsted are saying is that schools can play their part in changing the culture in our society. That means that some children, young people, think that these are normalised behaviours when absolutely they're not. Okay, well, just to say that as ever, we've put the references for the key documents that we've referred to. So the Ofsted review is the main one here, but obviously we've linked DfE guidance and the new version of Keeping Children Safe as well. So if you'd like to access those, please do so. And then finally, just to say thank you very much indeed for joining us for this session this morning. I'm sorry we've run over a few moments, but I hope that's because we've spent time responding to your individual questions. We hope you found it useful. We hope you found it thought-provoking. That was our aim today, and we hope that you take something forward from this to your own governing boards. All that remains for me to say is thank you very much again for coming. We do hope to see you again in the not too distant future. We will be back in the autumn term with you again via Governors for Schools. There is a short evaluation which we'd ask you to complete for Governors for Schools, and they'd be very grateful if you would do that. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy your summer if you're getting one, but above all else, please do stay safe. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you everyone, and goodbye.
Goodbye everybody.